The sharp, clinical stench of rubbing alcohol hits my sinuses, mixing with the metallic tang of blood seeping from my locked jaw. The cracked screen of my iPhone on the nightstand flickers to life. It is 6:38 p.m. An Instagram post pops up. There they are, my mother and sister, standing at gate 24 of the Austin airport, clutching oversized margaritas and wearing matching sun-drenched grins. The caption reads, "Hawaii, here we come. I am Alisha Bentley, a 32-year-old captain in the United States Army. Just last week, I signed a $4,800 check to pay for my sister's wedding dress. Today, I am lying in an ICU bed with a brain bleed that is trying to kill me. Doctors say I might not make it past the next 48 hours. In my own flesh and blood?" They checked their watches, ignored the red alarms on my heart monitor, and used my credit card to fly off to paradise. Never believe that blood is thicker than water. To people like them, blood is just something for parasites to suck dry before they toss your body onto the battlefield. If you have ever carried your entire family only to be abandoned when you were at your lowest, let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Don't go anywhere. Because the way they are going to pay for this, it is going to make you forget to blink. It was 11:47 p.m. at the Austin base, and the air inside the SCIF was so recycled it felt like I was breathing through a dusty wool blanket. I downed my fourth cup of black coffee, which had long ago gone cold, and left a bitter, oily film on my tongue. The keyboard beneath my fingers was standard military issue, clunky and loud, but it was the only thing keeping me grounded as I stared at the dual monitors. On the left screen, I had a massive audit report for the Pentagon regarding a $12 million logistics discrepancy. It was the kind of high-stakes accounting that would make most people lose sleep, but for me it was just another Tuesday night in the Army. On the right screen, though, was the spreadsheet that was actually killing me. I called it the family file. The numbers in the debt column were typed in a clinical blood red font, and they currently sat at $26,771 for this year alone. I scrolled through the line items with a thumb that would not stop shaking. There was the monthly installment for my sister Brittany's Ford Explorer because apparently a public school teacher cannot be seen driving a used sedan. There were the credit card payments I'd taken over when her interest rates spiraled out of control because she just had to have that designer wardrobe for her engagement photos. Then there was the security deposit for her new apartment in a neighborhood she could not afford. Over the last 8 years, I'd funneled $187,400 into the bottomless pit of my family's needs. That was money earned in the dirt of overseas deployments and the soul-crushing boredom of stateside logistics. My neck popped with a sound like dry kindling snapping, and my left eye began a frantic rhythmic twitch that I could not control. Just as I tried to focus back on the Pentagon audit, my phone started dancing across the aluminum desk surface. It was a text from Brittany. She told me the wedding dress was finally ready, but the wedding fund was suddenly $25,000 short. She said since I was the maid of honor, I needed to wire the money tonight because the coordinator was breathing down her neck. Before I could even process the audacity of a $25,000 request, my phone buzzed again with a voicemail from my mother. Her voice crackled through the speaker with that familiar sharp edge of entitlement. "Alisha?" She said, "You are not married and you do not have kids. So what are you even doing with that big officer salary?" She told me I needed to pay for the family trip to Hawaii, which would cost $8,200. She actually had the nerve to say that if I could not be there in person, the least I could do was make sure my money was present. I looked at my actual bank balance, which sat at $4,230, and I felt my jaw clench so hard I thought my molars might shatter. That was when the physical world started to come apart. A pain so sharp it felt like a concrete drill bit had been slammed into the base of my skull, radiated upward into my eyes. I reached out to the keyboard to type a single word to my sister, which was no, but my right hand refused to obey. My index and middle fingers were just dead weight on the plastic keys. The neat rows of the Excel sheet began to blur into a messy gray sludge, and a wave of heat surged from my chest up into my throat. I could taste something metallic like I was sucking on a handful of old pennies, and I realized it was the taste of my own blood rising into the back of my mouth. The left side of my face suddenly felt heavy like lead weights were pulling my skin toward the floor. I tried to push my chair back to stand up, but my legs, which were still laced tight into my desert boots, felt like they belonged to a stranger. I lost my balance and tumbled forward, hitting the cold laminate floor with a sickening thud. I lay there staring at the dust bunnies under the server rack as my breath started to come in short, ragged whistles through my teeth. The hum of the cooling fans in the SCIF was the only sound in the room, and it felt deafeningly loud in my ears. On the screen above me, the cursor in the family file spreadsheet just kept blinking in that empty white cell, waiting for me to add more numbers to the debt. The darkness began to creep in from the edges of my vision, turning the blue light of the monitors into a pinpoint of distant stars. I heard the muffled sound of heavy combat boots running down the hallway outside, followed by the unmistakable metallic bang of the security door being forced open. Someone was yelling for a medic and calling out that an officer was down, but their voices sounded like they were underwater. As my heart rate began to slow into a sluggish thumping in my chest, I found myself thinking about that Hawaii trip. In my delirious state, I actually hoped that when my mother saw me being carried out on a stretcher, she would finally cry for me instead of just asking for my credit card. The rhythm of the heart monitor was the only thing telling me I was still in the room. It was a steady hollow beep that echoed against the sterile white tiles of St. David's Medical Center. It was 11:52 p.m. when the medevac team finally got me through the doors and into a stabilization unit. I was drifting in and out of a dark fog, but I could hear the nurse, a woman named Amanda, grabbing my phone. She was searching for a contact someone to tell that an Army captain was dying in her ward. She found the name Mom Vivian and hit dial. I heard the long, lonely rings filling the room. Silence. Then the mechanical click of a voicemail. Between 1:15 a.m. and 5:45 a.m., Amanda tried again. She was persistent. I will give her that. She dialed that number 11 times while the machines hissed and pumped air into my lungs. Each time she got the same result. Nothing. I was lying there under a thin sheet with sensors stuck to my chest and my head shaved for the emergency drain, waiting for a voice that never came. My own mother was 25 minutes away in a suburb of Austin, probably sleeping on high thread count sheets I had paid for. It was not until 7 a.m. that the phone finally connected. I heard Vivian answer with a heavy yawn and a voice that sounded more annoyed than worried. "I will be there when I can," she said. It was like she was making an appointment for a hair salon. 9:30 a.m. came, and the heavy double doors of the ICU finally swung open. My family arrived, but this was not a reunion. It was a 33-minute clinical observation. My sister Brittany stayed by the door, clutching her purse like she was afraid she might catch my condition. She kept her mask pulled tight, and I watched her eyes darting to her phone every few seconds. "This smell makes me nauseous," she whispered loud enough for me to hear through the fog. My stepfather Gilbert did not even enter the room. He stood in the hallway with his phone pressed to his ear, talking about a real estate deal, as if his stepdaughter was not currently fighting a brain bleed. Vivian walked to the foot of my bed, but she stayed at a distance. She did not reach out to hold my hand or brush the hair away from my forehead. I was looking for a spark of motherly instinct, but all I saw was a quick glance at the thick plastic tube in my throat, followed by an immediate look at her Cartier watch. The gold on her wrist caught the harsh fluorescent light, and it felt like a slap in the face. The doctor came in holding my chart, and his voice was low and serious. He told them I was stable for the moment, but still in a state of extreme crisis. He told them I could be in a coma for days, and that the outcome was far from certain. Vivian had a way of hearing only what she wanted to hear. Her ears filtered out words like critical and crisis and focused entirely on the word stable. She adjusted her wool coat and pulled Brittany into the hallway. They thought the heavy glass of the ICU room would block their voices, but in the silence of a hospital, sounds carry. I watched them through the window. I saw my mother let out a small sigh, and a smirk touched her lips. "Stable means she is not dying right now," she told Brittany. "We can still make it to the airport on time." Brittany bit her lip, looking conflicted, but not because of me. "But Mom, the tickets Alisha bought are non-refundable," she said. "And the wedding is coming up. I need this." Vivian just nodded as she smoothed out the wrinkles in her expensive jacket. "Alisha's a soldier," she said. She's tough and she knows how to handle herself. She would want you to go and distress before the big day. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. They were trading my life for a beach in Maui. They were using my sacrifice as a reason to abandon me. Vivian did not even turn around to look at me one last time. I heard the sharp rhythmic click of her heels on the linoleum floor as she walked toward the elevator. It was a cold final sound that echoed in my chest long after they were gone. By 3:15 p.m., I was alone again with the machines. My phone on the nightstand buzzed with a new voicemail. It was 14 seconds long. Vivian sounded rushed, like she was standing in a crowd. Alisha, the doctor said, "You are fine," she said. "Me and Brittany are getting on the plane now. Just take care of yourself, okay?" That was it. No, I love you. No, call us if things get worse. Just a directive to handle my own survival while they headed for the gate. 1838 was the moment the world truly shattered. My blood pressure started to tank, and the alarms on the monitor began to scream. Nurse Amanda rushed in and grabbed my phone to try one last call to the family. When she swiped the screen, an Instagram notification popped up. It was a photo Brittany had just posted. The three of them were standing at Gate 24 of the Austin airport with their arms around each other. They were holding margaritas and grinning like they had just won the lottery. The caption was, "Hawaii, here we come." I was lying in a bed of ice and tubes, and they were drinking to a vacation I had funded with my own blood. In that moment, I realized I was not a daughter or a sister to them. I was just a bank account that had finally hit its limit. If you have ever felt like the only person holding your family together while they treated you like a ghost, let me know in the comments. Have you ever been abandoned when you needed them most? Drop a 1 in the comments if you have ever had to be your own hero because the people who were supposed to love you were too busy looking at their own reflections. I want to hear your stories because today I'm realizing that some bridges are meant to be burned. Like this video if you think family is about who shows up, not just who shares your DNA. The automatic doors on the 4th floor slid open with a sharp, pneumatic hiss at exactly 8 p.m. A man stepped through, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who had spent decades in combat boots. He wasn't wearing a uniform now, just a dark, heavy wool charcoal overcoat that seemed to absorb the sterile white light of the ICU hallway. His hair was a shock of winter white, cropped close to his head, and his face was a map of deep lines and old scars that spoke of a life lived in the shadows of the defense industry. His name was Walter Kendrick, a man the tabloids called the lone wolf of defense contracting. But to me, in the dark corners of my fading consciousness, he was just a presence. He didn't stop at the nurse's station to ask permission. He walked straight to the glass of room 412. He didn't knock, and he didn't cry. He stood there, perfectly still, his back straight as a rod, like a sentinel standing guard over a fallen comrade on a lonely ridge. For 3 hours, from 8 to 11 p.m., he didn't move a single muscle. I could feel him there, a weight in the room that pushed back against the cold emptiness my mother had left behind. In the final minute of his watch, he stepped closer and pressed a large calloused palm against the cold glass. His breath fanned out in a gray mist against the pane, a small circle of warmth in a world that had gone freezing. When Nurse Amanda finally found the courage to approach him, his voice came out like gravel grinding in a jar. He didn't look at her, he just kept his eyes on the tubes snaking out of my throat. "I just wanted to make sure," he whispered, "that the girl wasn't left behind on the field." The morning of November 20th brought a different kind of noise. The alarms on my life support system began to scream, a high-pitched, frantic electronic wail that sliced through the quiet. Secondary myocarditis. My heart was failing because the rest of my body was under siege. The lead surgeon, a man who looked like he hadn't slept since the Reagan administration, told the staff I needed open heart surgery within 48 hours, or I was a ghost. Amanda went to work on the phones immediately, calling the Pentagon to trigger my TRICARE insurance. But the system was a nightmare of red tape. They told her it would take 72 hours just to authorize an out-of-network procedure at a civilian hospital like St. David's. The hospital administration was even colder. They demanded a $15,000 cash deposit before they would even prep the OR Amanda called Hawaii. I could hear the tinny sound of the surf and a ukulele playing somewhere in the background of the speakerphone. Vivian answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with irritation. "Who is paying for what?" she snapped when Amanda explained the deposit. "I don't have that kind of money sitting around. I'm on vacation, for God's sake." Amanda tried to explain that I would die without the surgery, but Vivian just sighed, a long, weary sound of a woman being inconvenienced by a minor chore. "Just send the bill to her house," Vivian said. "She's an army captain with a high salary and a death benefit. She can figure it out." "I won't be back until Monday anyway." The line went dead. 20 seconds. That was the exact amount of time it took for my biological mother to decide that a margarita on a beach was worth more than my heart beating another day. 12 miles away, in a glass-walled office on the 30th floor overlooking downtown Austin, a secure, encrypted phone began to chirp. Walter Kendrick didn't even look at the caller ID. He knew who it was. My commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, delivered the sitrep in less than a minute. Walter didn't blink. He reached into the pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a wallet made of ballistic nylon. He extracted a card that didn't look like any credit card I had ever seen. A solid, matte black slab of heavy metal that felt like a weapon. He turned to his assistant without looking up from his military-grade laptop. "Shift the priority on the Lockheed account," he said, his voice cold and flat. "I need to pay a bill. Now." 30 minutes later, the heavy metal card hit the marble counter of the hospital's billing office with a distinct, authoritative clink. Walter stood there, his hands deep in the pockets of his overcoat, watching the clerk with a gaze that could have stripped paint off a tank. "Pay it," he said. "Everything. The ICU, the surgeons, the recovery, and the best physical therapy team in the state of Texas." The clerk's jaw nearly hit the desk when the screen showed the authorization for $139,000. She looked at the blank space on the intake form under the Section 4 next of kin, and then back at the man with the silver hair and the black card. "Mr. Kendrick," she stammered, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "The hospital policy requires us to verify the relationship for the guarantor. Are you family? What exactly is your relationship to Captain Bentley?" Walter didn't answer right away. He turned his head slightly, looking down the long, sterile hallway that led to the surgical wing where I was being prepped. A heavy, weighted silence filled the room, the kind of silence you find in a foxhole before the sun comes up. He cleared his throat, a low rumble of thunder. "Ma'am," he said, dropping each word onto the marble counter like a heavy stone, "there is more than one kind of father in this world." He leaned in just an inch, his eyes boring into hers. "Swipe the card, keep my name off the public records, and make sure that girl lives to see the sun tomorrow." Day 5. I opened my eyes to a world that tasted like old copper and felt like sandpaper. The ceiling was a flat, clinical gray-white, and for a long time, I just stared at the intersection of two acoustic tiles, trying to remember how to breathe without a machine doing it for me. My throat was a raw, jagged mess of torn tissue where the endotracheal tube had lived for the last few days. Every swallow felt like I was gulping down broken glass. I slowly turned my head to the left, expecting to see the weary, tear-streaked face of my mother. Or maybe Brittany sleeping fitfully in the guest chair. But the plastic chair was empty. There was no one there to hold my hand or tell me it was going to be okay. Instead, resting on the seat of that chair was a wool blanket, folded with the kind of precise 45-degree military corners that I hadn't seen since my days at West Point. On top of the blanket sat a small, battered, leather-bound book. The edges were frayed, the spine creased from years of being opened and closed. I reached out with fingers that were still taped with IV sensors, my skin pale and translucent under the harsh hospital lights. I pulled the book toward me. It was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I fanned open the cover, and my heart skipped a beat. On the inside flap, written in a heavy slanted hand with ink that had bled slightly into the paper, were 8 words. To my daughter. "I hope one day you understand why I had to stay back. WK." The heavy door creaked open, and Nurse Amanda pushed her cart into the room. She didn't say anything at first, She just clicked her medical pen light and checked my pupils, her face a mask of professional exhaustion. When she saw me holding the book, her expression softened for a fraction of a second. I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a pathetic, dry rasp. I asked about my family. Amanda stopped what she was doing and pulled a cardboard-backed clipboard from her cart, dropping it onto the rolling bedside table with a dull thud. She didn't sugarcoat it. She told me that Vivian and Brittany had boarded a flight to Hawaii 5 days ago. She told me they had explicitly refused to pay the $15,000 deposit required for the emergency heart surgery that saved my life. I swallowed hard, feeling that metallic tang of blood rise in the back of my throat again. Amanda pointed through the glass partition toward the hallway, her eyes narrowing with a strange kind of respect. She told me that I was only alive because of a $139,000 payment made in cold, hard cash by a man named Walter Kendrick. She said he had stood guard outside my door for 3 straight nights, never sleeping, never leaving his post until the surgeons confirmed I was stable. He told her he was my father. My breath hitched in my chest. My father had died in a car accident when I was 3. At least, that was the story Vivian had shoved down my throat for 32 years. I waited until Amanda left the room to check on another patient before I grabbed the iPad she had left on my tray. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped the thin slab of glass. I typed the name Walter Kendrick into the search bar, and the data exploded across the screen like shrapnel. Walter Brennan Kendrick, 63 years old, former Army engineer. CEO of a massive defense investment firm. I pinched the screen to zoom in on a Forbes profile photo from 2 years ago. The resemblance was haunting. The same steel gray eyes, the same slight hook in the bridge of the nose, and a jawline so square it looked like it was carved from granite. It was the face my mother used to scream at in the middle of the night before she smashed dishes in our kitchen. Then I started connecting the dots, my military intelligence training taking over even through the fog of the painkillers. I searched for the scholarship that had paid every cent of my tuition back in 2012, the one I thought I had won on merit alone. It was funded by the Kendrick Foundation. I looked into the anonymous venture capital firm that had injected $1.8 million into my tech startup, Evergrid, last year, when I was on the brink of bankruptcy. It was a shell company owned by Kendrick Holdings. Every major win in my life, every time I thought I had just caught a lucky break, it hadn't been luck at all. It had been him. He had been watching me from the shadows for 3 decades, a silent sentinel protecting a daughter he wasn't allowed to claim. I let the iPad slip from my fingers and fall onto the white hospital sheets. For 32 years, I had worked myself into the ground like a pack mule, desperately throwing money at Brittany and my mother just to buy a single crumb of their approval. Vivian had spent my entire life calling me a burden, a mistake, a piece of bad luck that she was forced to carry. But while she was busy draining my bank account and leaving me to die in an ICU bed, a man I didn't even know was building a financial fortress around me. He had constructed an invisible shield to catch the bullets my own family was firing at my back. I wasn't the worthless child Vivian had tried to create. I was a multi-million-dollar defense project for a father who loved me from a distance. A single, hot tear rolled down my cheek and soaked into the white gauze taped to my neck. I didn't let the second one fall. I reached up and wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, my jaw set in the same hard line as the man in the Forbes photo. The weakness was gone. My mother is scheduled to land back in Austin tomorrow morning, likely tanned and refreshed from the vacation she bought with my blood. She thinks she is coming home to a grateful daughter who will continue to fund her lifestyle. She thinks the scapegoat is still waiting in this bed, ready to be bled dry again. But she's wrong. This isn't just a recovery anymore. This is a counterinsurgency. I have spent my life defending a family that never existed, and now it's time to show Vivian what happens when an army captain finally stops taking orders from a traitor. The silence of the 4th floor ICU was a fragile thing, usually only broken by the soft hiss of oxygen or the distant, rhythmic squeak of a nurse's rubber-soled shoes. But on Saturday morning, that silence was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in a place of healing. It was the aggressive, rattling grind of high-end suitcase wheels. Louis Vuitton, most likely, tearing across the sterile linoleum floor. I sat up in bed, my chest tightening as the sound grew louder. My heart monitor began a frantic, accelerated chirp, echoing the spike in my pulse. Then came the smell. It wasn't the scent of antiseptic or the metallic tang of blood I'd grown used to. It was the cloying, synthetic odor of cheap coconut sunscreen and overpriced duty-free perfume. It was the smell of Hawaii. It was the smell of a vacation paid for with my near-death experience. Vivian didn't even glance toward the glass window of room 412. I watched her through the gap in the privacy curtain. She looked refreshed, her skin a deep, sun-drenched bronze that mocked my own translucent, hospital-gray pallor. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses pushed up onto her head and carrying a shopping bag from a high-end boutique at the airport. She marched straight to the nurse's station and tapped her acrylic nails against the marble counter with a sharp, impatient click, clink, click. "I'm the mother of the Bentley girl in 412, she said, her voice loud and devoid of any maternal warmth. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I was awake. "I need to confirm the billing status on her insurance. My daughter is an Army officer with a high-limit policy. Just make sure the final invoice is sent to her apartment in Austin. She can handle her own affairs." She adjusted her sunglasses and checked her phone, likely counting the likes on her latest beach photo, while I sat 10 feet away with a scarred heart and a broken brain. The clerk behind the desk, a young woman who looked like she hadn't slept in 36 hours, didn't move. She just pulled a bright yellow receipt from a folder, the kind marked "paid in full" with a heavy, ink-drenched stamp. "Ma'am," the clerk said, her voice vibrating with a quiet, professional edge. "The $139,000 balance has already been settled. It was paid via a private black card 3 days ago. This is the guarantor's signature." Vivian snatched the paper. Her sunglasses slipped down the bridge of her nose as her eyes locked onto the bottom right corner. The name Walter B. Kendrick was scrawled there in bold, uncompromising blue ink. The duty-free bag slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud as expensive chocolates spilled out. That was when the shadow fell over her. A man, 6'1" and built like a fortress, stepped out from the shadows of the waiting area. Walter Kendrick didn't look like a CEO in that moment. He was wearing a weathered field jacket and heavy military boots that still had a light dusting of Texas soil on the soles. He stood directly in front of Vivian, his massive frame cutting off her only path to the elevators. Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were low, rumbling from deep in his chest like a tank idling in the mud. 32 years, Vivian, he said. The hallway seemed to grow colder as he spoke. "I gave up my rights because you threatened to use the local police and your new husband's connections to bury me. I stayed away so you could play the part of the perfect, struggling mother. I stood guard in this hallway for 3 nights while you were 3,000 miles away." Vivian stumbled back, her designer heels catching on the hem of her own coat. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "You have no right to be here," she shrieked, her voice cracking like dry wood. "You're a stranger, a ghost. I am the one who raised her. I am her mother." Walter leaned in, his face inches from hers. I could see the muscles in his jaw rippling. "You aren't a mother, Vivian," he whispered, each word landing like a physical blow. "You were in Hawaii drinking margaritas on her credit card while she was in here with a hole in her heart. You let her work herself into a stroke so she could pay for your other daughter's wedding. You aren't family. You're a parasite." Vivian's arm swung out, her heavy purse slamming into Walter's chest, but he didn't even flinch. He remained as still as a mountain. She went for her oldest weapon, the victim card. "It was 1992, Walter," she screamed, loud enough to make the other nurses turn their heads. "You were gone. You were always gone with the engineers, playing soldier in the dirt. I was pregnant and alone. I had to find a man with actual money to give us a life. Alisha owes me for the very breath in her lungs. If it weren't for me finding a way to cover up your mistake, she wouldn't even have a name." The words hit me harder than the stroke ever could. I lay in my bed, my teeth grinding together so hard I could taste the metallic tang of blood in my mouth again. I was a mistake. I was a cover-up. My entire life of service, of sacrifice, of being the family ATM was just a way for her to punish me for her own infidelity. I reached out with my left hand, the one that still felt like lead. My fingers found the medical tape on the back of my hand, the one holding the IV line in place. With a sharp, sudden jerk, I ripped it off. I didn't feel the pain, only the hot, sticky sensation of blood beginning to seep from the vein. I slammed my palm down on the red nurse call button on the bed rail, my eyes fixed on the door. The alarm began to pulse, a high, urgent electronic scream that cut through Vivian's lies. I wasn't the scapegoat anymore. I was a captain in the United States Army, and the enemy was finally in my sights. The silence of room 412 didn't last. The heavy pressurized door swung open with such violence it hit the rubber stopper on the wall with a dull, echoing thud. Vivian didn't walk in, she stormed in. She was a whirlwind of frantic energy, her designer sunglasses now perched haphazardly on top of her dyed hair, her face flushed a blotchy, angry red. She didn't even look at the heart monitor that was still chirping a warning yellow light or the plastic bins filled with used medical supplies. She went straight for the bed rail, her manicured hands gripping the cold metal so hard her knuckles turned white. "Alisha!" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the clinical quiet like a serrated blade. "You have to call security right now. Tell them to get that maniac out of the hallway. He's out there screaming at me, saying horrible things. He's delusional, Alisha. He's trying to poison your mind." She stood there, panting, waiting for the familiar response. She was waiting for me to apologize, to shrink back into the pillows, to tell her I was sorry she was upset and that I would handle it. She was waiting for the good daughter to fix her problems again. But that girl had died somewhere between the stroke and the moment I saw that Instagram post. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. Slowly, deliberately, I reached over with my left hand and peeled back the last of the medical tape anchoring the IV to my skin. I watched the blood well up in a dark, thick bead on the back of my hand. I didn't care. I braced my elbows against the stiff hospital mattress and pushed myself upright. My chest burned where the surgeons had gone in, a raw, grinding ache that reminded me I was still made of flesh and bone, but my mind was as cold as a winter morning in the Hindu Kush. I stared at her. I locked my eyes onto the smeared trail of cheap sunscreen on her neck and the frantic, shallow rise and fall of her chest. Walter stepped into the room then. He didn't say a word. He didn't try to defend himself. He just walked to the far corner of the room, near the window, and folded his massive arms over his chest. He stood there like a statue of granite, silent and watchful. He wasn't taking over. He was clearing the stage. He was giving me the perimeter, letting me know that for the first time in 32 years, I was the commanding officer of my own life. I reached for the iPhone sitting on the rolling tray and flicked it open. I didn't say a word as I turned the screen toward her. I let the image of the Austin airport gate hang in the air between us. The margaritas, the smiles, the sun-kissed glow of a family that didn't have a care in the world while I was being prepped for a bypass. "Business class seats," I said, my voice sounding like gravel being ground under a boot. It was dry, raspy, and devoid of any warmth. 4-star resort. All while I was waiting for them to crack my ribs open just to keep my heart beating. Vivian's face went from red to a sickly, translucent white. She let go of the bed rail and took a stumbling step back, her hands fluttering near her throat like trapped birds. "Alisha? Honey, you don't understand. The doctors. They said you were stable. We had already paid for the trip, and Brittany was so stressed. Her wedding dress needed the final payment, and I thought—" "You thought my credit card would just keep working," I interrupted. The words were short, sharp, and clinical. I swiped the medical charts off the bed, sending the folders clattering across the floor. "You used my card to pay for the hotel. You tried to bully a nurse into taking $25,000 more for Brittany's dream day, while I was literally unconscious. You funded every single one of your delusions with my blood, Vivian. And when I was down, when the tab came due for my actual life, you walked away." "That's not fair," she hissed, trying to find her footing again. She tried to go back to the old script, the one where she was the martyr. I gave you life. You were a mistake I chose to keep. You owe me everything. I looked past her at the man in the corner, the man who had spent 32 years in the shadows just to make sure I had a chance. Then I looked back at her. The debt is settled, Vivian, I said, my voice dropping into a register that made her flinch. My life was just bought back for $139,000 by the man standing in that corner. He paid the bill you refused to touch. So, as far as I'm concerned, the balance between us is 0. I pointed my blood-streaked hand toward the door. Here's the new sitrep. As of this second, the logistics line is cut. I called the bank an hour ago. Every card in your possession is locked. The recurring payments for Brittany's Ford and your apartment? Cancelled. You and Gilbert can figure out how to pay your own mortgage for the first time in a decade. Vivian's mouth fell open. She looked like she had been slapped. She tried to summon one last scream, one last guilt trip about being a mother, but the air seemed to have left the room. She was just a woman in a cheap souvenir t-shirt, realizing the golden goose had finally stopped laying. Get out, I said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Nurse Amanda appeared in the doorway, 2 burly hospital security guards flanking her. They didn't hesitate. They stepped in and took Vivian by the arms. She tried to struggle, her Louis Vuitton bag slipping off her shoulder and landing in a heap on the floor, but they were already moving her toward the hall. The door slid shut, cutting off the sound of her frantic screeching. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that follows a successful breach. I fell back against the pillows, my breath coming in jagged hitches. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. I turned my head to the right. Walter was still there. He hadn't moved an inch. I'm tired of being the one who carries the weight while everyone else enjoys the view. Have you ever reached that point where you just had to say, no more? Drop a done in the comments if you've ever had to cut off someone you loved just to save yourself. I want to see how many of us are out here, finally setting our own boundaries. Like this if you think family is earned, not just born. I looked at the empty plastic chair where my mother should have been. Then I looked at Walter. I nodded toward the seat. You can sit down now, I whispered. The 63-year-old billionaire, a man who had stared down generals and CEOs, took off his glasses and wiped his eyes with his sleeve. He pulled the chair close to the bed, sat down, and finally, the sentinel was home. Tuesday morning arrived with the sharp scent of ozone and printer toner as Nurse Amanda wheeled a portable medical station into my room. This was not for vitals. It was for war. On the other end of the secure line was the JAG office at the Pentagon. I could hear the muffled sounds of a busy military legal center in the background, the distant clack of keyboards, and the low hum of voices that spoke in the language of regulations and consequences. I sat up as straight as my healing chest would allow, my jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. Actually, it was funny how the hospital gown felt more like a uniform once I had a mission in front of me. I gripped the plastic ballpoint pen, feeling the ridge of the cap dig into my thumb. I placed the tip onto the official legal document known as Form 2848. The JAG officer, a lieutenant colonel with a voice as dry as a desert floor, walked me through the lines. I pressed down hard, watching the blue ink bleed through the carbon paper as I officially struck the name Vivian Bentley from my records. I did not just remove her. I executed a total revocation of her power of attorney. For 7 years, while I was deployed in some of the most God-forsaken corners of the world, she had held the keys to my life. She had the legal right to drain my savings, sign my medical waivers, and basically decide if I was worth saving. I wrote the words, "Revoke all authority" in the blank box, my handwriting steady and jagged. I slid the paper into the fax machine and listened to that high-pitched electronic scream as the data traveled back to DC. It was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in weeks. The vault was officially sealed with concrete. Walter watched from the corner, his eyes unblinking. He moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, sliding the breakfast tray closer to my chest. He placed an encrypted satellite phone on the plastic surface. I did not hesitate. I dialed the priority hotline for Chase Bank. The bitter tang of my morning anticoagulant pill sat on the back of my tongue, but I welcomed the sharpness. A man named Marcus answered the call, his voice polished and professional. He asked if I was calling to report a lost Visa signature card ending in 4921. I adjusted the phone, my voice dropping into that low, tactical register I used when giving field orders. I told him no. I told him I was reporting fraudulent activity. I gave him the specific details for the secondary card held by Brittany Bentley. I told him to cancel it immediately and freeze the entire $30,000 credit limit. I heard the frantic clicking of his keys. He confirmed it was done. Right now, at this very moment, Brittany was likely standing in a high-end bridal boutique in downtown Austin, surrounded by lace and silk she could never afford. She was about to try and swipe for a dream that just vanished into the digital ether. Walter reached down and grabbed a heavy, distressed leather briefcase from the floor. He set it on the bed, the metal locks clicking open with a sound like a round being chambered. He did not pull out stacks of cash. He pulled out a life worth of evidence. He laid out the files in neat, overlapping rows on my lap. There was a DNA test from 1993, stamped with the red seal of a private lab in Houston. It confirmed everything. Then there was the restraining order. It was a forgery, a legal nightmare Vivian had used her new husband Gilbert's connections to craft, forcing Walter away just as he was transitioning out of the service. I ran my fingers over the edge of the paper, feeling the texture of 32 years of lies. Walter looked at me, his face a mask of restrained intensity. He told me he had stayed silent to protect whatever piece I had left, but that Gilbert deserved to know who he had really been supporting all these years. I reached for my iPad and opened the Charles Schwab brokerage app. The screen glowed with a cold blue light, illuminating the dark circles under my eyes. I navigated to my holdings in Evergrid, the defense tech company I'd poured my soul into. The countdown clock on the dashboard was ticking. 48 hours until the IPO. For 3 years, my equity had been a ghost, a number on a screen that I could not touch. Now, the status read, pending liquidity. The projected balance was $280,000. It was not just money to me. It was a tactical strike. If I had not stripped Vivian's power of attorney 10 minutes ago, she could have liquidated this entire stake with a single phone call to Gilbert's bank. She would have used my sweat and my near-death experience to buy Gilbert a new boat or pay for Brittany's honeymoon in Bali. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over my ribs. The clock was running down on the wedding. Brittany had exactly 72 hours before the final venue payments were due. Vivian had 48 hours before her own mortgage check would bounce. Here is the thing about being a logistics officer. I know exactly when the fuel runs out. I know exactly when the ammunition crates go empty. I had spent my life keeping their tanks full while I ran on fumes. I leaned back against the thin hospital pillow and watched the seconds on the IPO clock flicker. The charges were set. The perimeter was secured. Now, I just had to wait for the spark to hit the fuse. I took a sip of lukewarm water, the plastic cup shaking only slightly. The counterinsurgency was no longer a plan. It was an active operation. The high-end bridal boutique called Bella Bridal smelled like a suffocating mix of expensive lavender detergent and false promises. Brittany stood on the circular pedestal in front of a massive triptych mirror, preening in a mermaid-style silk gown that cost $4,800. It was a masterpiece of lace and vanity, hugging her in all the right places while she practiced her wedding walk for a crowd of bored sales associates who had seen 1,000 girls just like her. Vivian stood behind her, adjusting the ivory veil with a look of triumphant satisfaction, acting like she had just brokered a peace treaty instead of spending money that belonged to the daughter she had left to die. Then came the sound that cut through the soft jazz playing over the hidden speakers. It was a sharp, rhythmic electronic screech from the credit card terminal at the front desk. Actually, it was the sound of a financial door slamming shut forever. The manager, a woman with a face as stiff as a board and eyes like cold marbles, looked at the screen and then back at Vivian. The machine flashed a red light and a message that simply read, "Transaction declined." Card locked. Vivian grabbed the card and tried again, her fingers fumbling with the plastic, her breathing getting shallow as she felt the eyes of the staff on her. Same result. 3 times. The manager didn't even wait for a 4th attempt. She reached over and snatched the paper invoice from Vivian's hand, her voice dropping to a cold, professional whisper that carried through the entire quiet store. She told them the primary card holder had reported the account for fraudulent activity and that the secondary card was now voided. Brittany didn't just cry, she let out a jagged shriek that likely shattered the composure of every bride-to-be in the building. My phone on the ICU nightstand vibrated 18 times in 20 minutes. I just stared at the screen, watched Vivian's frantic sun-damaged face pop up over and over in the caller ID, and then I swiped the red icon to reject the call every single time. By Thursday evening, the air at the local steakhouse downtown was thick with the scent of charred ribeye and the impending collapse of the Bentley family name. The groom's family had gathered for what was supposed to be a final celebration to finalize the $25,000 deposit for the reception hall. Instead, it turned into a tactical disaster. Without the wire transfer from the sister they called the Captain, the entire wedding budget had turned into a puff of smoke. The groom's father, a retired lawyer who knew exactly how to sniff out a financial scam, tossed the venue contract onto the table between the appetizers and the main course. He asked Vivian straight up if she really expected his son to walk into a marriage carrying $25,000 in debt before they even reached the honeymoon suite. Brittany pounded the table, her face blotchy and desperate, while she tried to blame a banking error that didn't exist. The groom didn't wait for the excuses to finish. He pushed his chair back, the heavy wood legs screeching against the tile like a dying animal, and dropped the engagement ring onto his half-eaten plate of beef. He told them the wedding was off. 48 hours before the ceremony was set to begin, the golden child was suddenly just another cautionary tale in a town that loved to gossip. Guests began receiving the cancellation emails before the appetizers were even cleared from the table. The pride and joy of Vivian's life was officially rotting on the floor of a steakhouse. Back at the Bentley house, the silence was even louder and more suffocating. Gilbert walked into the kitchen and tossed his truck keys onto the granite island with a heavy metallic clatter. He found a plain, unmarked brown envelope sitting next to the pepper mill. No return address, no name. He tore the flap open, the sound of the paper ripping like a gunshot in the quiet house. Out slid the DNA results from 1993 and the forged restraining order Walter had kept for 3 decades. Gilbert sat there for a long time, the refrigerator humming in the background, staring at the number, 99.9% relationship probability. He realized the last 32 years of his marriage had been a carefully scripted performance designed by Vivian to keep a paycheck coming in. He realized the daughter he had spent decades treating like a ghost was the only person in that house who had ever actually worked for what she had. Gilbert didn't yell or throw things. He just went to the master bedroom, pulled a dusty Samsonite suitcase from the top shelf of the closet, and began tossing his shirts inside with a rhythmic, hollow thud. The family unit wasn't just breaking, it was dissolving in real time. Friday morning in the ICU felt like the dawn after a long siege. The blue light from the NASDAQ ticker on my iPad reflected off the glass of my heart monitor, turning the room a cool, electronic shade of teal. Evergrid was officially going public under the ticker EVGD. My fingers were steady as I watched the opening bell ceremony on the live stream. The numbers on the screen began to climb, turning from a cautionary red to a brilliant, liquid green that felt like oxygen in my lungs. I refreshed my brokerage account and saw the status change to successful. $280,000 was sitting in my brand new USAA account. It was a number Vivian and Brittany would never see, and a fortress they could never breach. It was my freedom, bought and paid for by my own sweat and Walter's silent protection. My phone buzzed one last time with a notification of the deposit, but I didn't even open the message. I just locked the screen and let the room go dark. Walter pushed the door open a moment later, carrying 2 cups of black coffee he had bought from the vending machine down the hall. He didn't ask about the wedding or the money or the chaos he knew was happening across town. He just pulled the plastic chair close to my bed and sat down, the steam from the coffee curling into the air. The shelling had finally stopped. The truth was out, the pretenders were gone, and for the first time in 32 years, I was the one left standing in the clearing, breathing air that belonged entirely to me. Saturday afternoon brought a tropical storm that swept through Austin with a vengeance. I watched the rain lash against the double-paned glass of room 412, the wind howling around the corners of St. David's like a wounded animal. It was the kind of heavy gray weather that usually makes people want to curl up under a blanket. But inside the ICU, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. Actually, I was just beginning to find my own quiet when the floor security officer's radio began to crackle. I heard the frantic, distorted voice of the guard at the main entrance downstairs. He was reporting a woman named Vivian Bentley, who was currently making a scene in the lobby, screaming that her daughter was being held hostage by a maniac. I looked at Nurse Amanda, who was checking my vitals. She didn't even have to ask. She picked up the wall unit and gave the order to deny access. She reminded them that I had a strict restricted visitor list and that the patient did not wish to see anyone from that party. I turned my head toward the nursing station monitor, where the internal security feed showed a grainy, wide-angle view of the lobby. There she was. Vivian looked like a mess, her hair matted from the rain and her clothes soaked through, pounding her fists against the bulletproof glass of the reception desk. Brittany was standing right next to her, clutching her face and sobbing so loudly I could almost hear it through the screen. They weren't crying because I was in a hospital bed with a scarred heart. I knew better. They were crying because Brittany's Ford Explorer had been towed from their driveway that morning by a repossession crew. The logistics line was truly dead, and the reality of their extinction burst was finally hitting the fan. They were losing their status, and to a narcissist, that is a fate worse than death. Sunday morning was quieter, the storm having passed and left the city dripping and humid. My phone buzzed on the tray with a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then hit accept. The voice on the other end was Gilbert, and he sounded like he had aged 20 years in a week. I could hear the rhythmic, familiar scratch of a match being struck and the heavy exhale of cigarette smoke. He told me he was staying at a Super 8 motel off the highway and that he had officially filed for divorce from my mother that morning. He sounded empty, just a hollowed-out version of the man who had sat at our dinner table for 3 decades. He apologized, his voice cracking as he said he had spent years looking the other way, pretending that letting Vivian control my money was just her way of teaching me independence. He told me he had no idea she had been hiding the truth about Walter for 32 years. He called me Captain one last time, told me to take care of myself, and then the line went dead. 32 years of a family history ended in a 45-second call from a budget motel room. The facade had finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I had one more bridge to burn. My voicemail was full, but there was one recording from Vivian that was 3 minutes long. I listened to it because I needed to hear the sound of the enemy's final surrender. Her voice was different this time, soft, trembling, and dripping with a forced, sugary vulnerability that made my skin crawl. She called me her sweet girl. She told me she was sorry, that she had been under so much pressure, and that she had just wanted the best for the family. But then the mask slipped. She started talking about how they were going to lose the house, how Gilbert had abandoned them, and how Brittany's engagement was officially over. She told me I was her flesh and blood and that I couldn't possibly watch my own mother starve on the streets. It was a masterpiece of crocodile tears. 7 years ago, I would have been on the phone in seconds, transferring my savings just to stop the sound of her crying. But now, all I heard was the desperate whine of a parasite that had just realized the host was no longer providing a blood supply. It was a cold, clinical realization that her love was entirely tied to my net worth. I stared at the phone screen for a long time after the message ended. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt a profound, heavy sense of exhaustion. I didn't call her back. I didn't send a long, dramatic text explaining my pain or justifying my choices. I realized that giving her an explanation was just giving her more ammunition to use against me. I decided to become a gray rock, while someone so boring, so devoid of emotional reaction, that she would eventually lose interest in trying to provoke me. I tapped the contact info button on my screen and scrolled all the way to the bottom, where the text glowed in a bright, uncompromising red. Block this caller. I hit confirm. Then I did the same for Brittany. The screen flickered for a second, and then years of messages, photos, and missed calls simply vanished into the digital void. The constant buzzing anxiety in the back of my skull finally went silent. The room felt lighter, the air cleaner. I poured myself a plastic cup of lukewarm water and took my pain medication, swallowing it down without a second thought. The headache that had been pulsing behind my eyes since the stroke was gone. I wasn't just recovering from a brain bleed, I was recovering from a lifetime of being someone else's ATM. I leaned back against the pillows and watched the sunlight crawl across the floor. For the first time in 32 years, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like peace. 3 weeks after the day my world cracked open and my brain felt like it was leaking through my ears, I found myself sitting in a cold plastic wheelchair outside the main entrance of St. David's Medical Center. The Texas winter wind was no joke. It slapped against my cheeks with a biting, dry cold that made me pull my jacket collar tight as I watched the gray exhaust from idling cars swirl into the morning air. I was clutching a thick manila folder containing my official medical discharge papers from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It listed me as 80% disabled, a clinical way of saying that the brain bleed had left a permanent mark on my motor skills. My career in the Army had reached its final checkpoint, and my time on the firing range was officially over. But as I sat there, I realized I was no longer the emotional trash can for my family to dump their waste into. My bank account at USAA was sitting heavy with $280,000 from the Evergrid IPO. I had lifetime health insurance and a credit score that finally didn't have Vivian's fingerprints all over it. A matte black armored SUV pulled up to the curb with a low, heavy rumble that I could feel in my chest. Walter hopped out, his movements quick and purposeful as he opened the trunk to pull out a personal foldable walker he had bought for me. He didn't rush over to baby me or offer some hollow words of pity. He just stood there by the open passenger door, zipping up his weathered field jacket to his chin while the wind tossed his silver hair. He looked at me with those steel gray eyes and asked if I could make it into the seat on my own, or if I needed him to carry me like a sack of potatoes. There was no condescension in his voice, and honestly, I loved him for it. He treated me like a soldier returning from a brutal tour, not a broken victim. I gripped the cold metal armrests of the wheelchair, channeled every bit of strength I had left into my right leg, and forced myself to stand. It took 10 long, shaky seconds to bridge the gap and pull myself onto the high leather bench seat of the SUV. Walter just gave a single, sharp nod of approval as if I had just completed a standard drill. He folded the wheelchair, tossed it into the back with a heavy, satisfying thud, and climbed into the driver's seat. He told me we were heading to his ranch out in the hill country where the air was clean and nobody could find us unless we wanted to be found. The V8 engine roared to life, a deep American growl that seemed to vibrate right through my bones as we pulled away from the hospital. I looked at the glass towers of downtown Austin in the rearview mirror and felt like I was leaving a graveyard behind. 6 months later, the world looked a whole lot different from the oak porch at the Kendrick Ranch. The morning fog was still thick over the tall grass, clinging to the wooden fences like a heavy gray blanket while the birds started their morning chatter. I held a chipped ceramic mug filled with burnt black espresso, watching the steam curl into the cold air. It was bitter and strong, the kind of drink that wakes up your soul after a long sleep. My left hand was back to 90% mobility, enough to grip the mug steadily without the tremor that had haunted me for months. There were no more frantic calls at 6 p.m. on a Sunday demanding rent money or crying about a missed car payment. No more shrieks from Brittany about wedding veils or the designer life she couldn't afford. No more of Vivian's jagged, poisonous insults echoing in the back of my head. I had bought a small stake in a software startup and spent my mornings managing the logistics from my laptop while looking out at the rolling hills. The biggest asset I owned now wasn't the cash in the bank or the equity in my name. It was the simple, quiet right to turn my phone off and sleep for 8 straight hours without the fear of being labeled selfish by people who only loved the numbers in my bank account. Walter walked out of the kitchen and tossed a folded, graying newspaper onto the cedar table between us. It was the local real estate classifieds, and he had circled a small section in red ink. I saw the address of Gilbert's old house listed under the foreclosure section. The bank had finally come to collect on the granite islands and the vaulted ceilings they never actually owned. Word through the military grapevine was that Vivian was living in a damp basement at an old friend's place, working the register at a Walmart just to keep her lights on. Brittany was reportedly grinding through double shifts as a waitress at a roadside diner, trying to pay off the credit card debt I had frozen months ago. They were finally reaping exactly what they had planted in those fields of manipulation and greed. Walter sat down across from me, his face calm and unreadable as he sipped his own coffee. He pulled a faded, crinkled photograph from his pocket. It was a picture of my mother back in 1992, looking young and full of the lies she was already perfecting. He looked at it for a few seconds, then flicked it into the stone fireplace where the morning logs were crackling and popping. The paper curled, turned a deep obsidian black, and vanished into a pile of gray ash. He raised his mug toward me in a silent salute and told me that the day was just beginning. I tapped my mug against his with a solid clink. The silence out here in the hills wasn't empty or lonely. It was the sound of actual freedom. The story of Alisha Bentley serves as a profound reminder that family is a verb, not just a noun found on a birth certificate. It is defined by who stays when the heart monitor screams, not by who checks their watch for a flight to paradise. The most vital lesson here is that setting a boundary is not an act of war. It is an act of self-preservation. When you finally stop acting as a reservoir for those who only know how to drain you, you allow yourself the space to breathe and heal. Choosing a found family isn't a betrayal of blood. It is a courageous investment in your own soul's survival and a step toward a morning that is truly your own. We have all stood at that painful crossroads, forced to decide if we are a beloved child or simply a convenient resource. Alisha's journey may have reached its peaceful conclusion, but your story is still being written. If her strength to cut the logistics line and embrace her true father resonated with you, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We are building a community for those who have dared to stand their ground. We want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to choose your own peace over a toxic family bond? Share your experience below. Your words might be the light someone else needs to find their way out of the dark.